Commander Zara stood 8 feet tall with dark scales that shined like black metal. Her eyes glowed yellow in the dim light of the space station. Sharp claws came out of her fingers when she was angry or scared. She belonged to a race called the Villani. They were hunters from a dangerous planet where only the strongest lived. The space station floated near a small moon. Different alien races worked together here to study strange things in space. Most creatures feared the Villani because they were such good fighters. Zara was the best fighter of all her people. She had brought her 2 babies to the station. Villani called their babies cubs. Kes was the smaller cub and Nira was bigger. They were 6 months old but already had sharp teeth and claws. On their home planet, cubs this age could hunt small animals by themselves. They never left their mother's side because the world was too dangerous. But today something terrible had happened. The cubs were gone. Zara searched every corner of their room. She smelled the air with her strong nose. She listened with ears that could hear sounds no human could detect. There were no signs of fighting. No smell trail leading away from the room. The door had not been forced open. It was like the cubs had just disappeared into nothing. This made no sense to Zara. Cubs never wandered off alone. It went against everything her people had learned over thousands of years. Cubs stayed close to their parents or they died. The station boss was a nervous alien named Grix. He had 4 arms and gray skin. His hands shook as he talked to the search teams. "We must find these cubs quickly," Grix said. "Nothing comes in or goes out of this station until they are safe. Search every room. Check every hallway." Dr. Jake Morrison walked up to the group. He was the only human on the station. Most aliens thought humans were strange and unpredictable. Jake was not very tall compared to Zara, but he was not afraid of her. His brown eyes looked calm even though everyone else was worried. "Commander Zara, I know you do not trust other species with your children," Jake said, "but I want to help find them. I have studied how your people behave. Maybe I will notice something others miss." Zara's yellow eyes stared at the human. She did not like humans much. They were too emotional and formed friendships too easily with creatures they barely knew. But her cubs were missing. She needed all the help she could get. "You can help search, human," she said in a low voice. "But if you slow us down or get in my way, I will consider you an enemy." Jake nodded. He understood she was threatening him. The search team spread out through different parts of the station. Jake followed Zara as she moved through the research areas. Even though she was worried, she moved like water flowing around rocks. Her head turned often to listen for sounds. Her nose tested the air for any trace of her cubs. Hours went by with no success. The cubs had simply vanished. Zara's patience was running out. Her people were not made for waiting. They were made for action. She had already snapped at 3 crew members who got too close. Her claws had left marks on 2 metal walls when her anger got too strong. Jake watched her carefully. He had spent years learning how different alien minds worked. He could see that Zara was reaching her breaking point. Soon her hunting instincts would take over completely. "Commander," Jake said quietly, "when cubs are scared, they sometimes do not act the way you expect. Try to think like a frightened child instead of a soldier." Zara spun around to face him. Her claws came out without her meaning to. "How dare you tell me I do not understand my own children? I am saying that fear changes how anyone acts. Even smart parents can be surprised. Your cubs have never been away from their home planet before, right? Everything here must seem strange to them. The sounds, the smells, even the way gravity feels is different." Zara paused. This was true. When they first arrived, Kes and Nira had stayed pressed against her legs. Usually they were brave and curious, but here they had seemed overwhelmed by all the new things around them. "Where would scared cubs go on a strange station?" she asked. Her voice was not as angry now. Jake thought for a moment. "Somewhere safe. Somewhere warm and hidden, but with ways to escape if needed. Somewhere that smells familiar somehow." They spent the next hour checking storage rooms and small spaces that fit what Jake described, but they found nothing. As they searched, Jake noticed that Zara was moving differently. She was thinking too hard and not trusting her instincts anymore. "Commander, when did you last sleep?" "Sleep?" She looked at him like he had said something crazy. "My cubs are missing. Villani parents do not sleep when their children are in danger. How long can your people go without rest before they cannot think clearly?" She did not answer, but Jake could see how tired she was. Her shoulders were starting to droop. Her species might be great hunters, but they still needed rest like any living creature. That was when they heard it. A faint sound coming through the air vents. It was not the hum of machines. It sounded alive. It sounded almost like purring. Zara's head snapped up. Her better hearing confirmed what Jake had barely detected. "That is them," she whispered. Relief and confusion mixed in her voice. But why would they be purring? Vellani cubs only purred when they felt completely safe and happy. Usually this happened when they were curled up against their mother's warm body. For them to purr while lost on an alien station made no sense at all. They followed the sound through the air system to a part of the station Jake knew well. It was coming from the human living area. More specifically, it was coming from his own room. Zara's maternal instincts were now stronger than her hunter nature. Jake could see her hands shaking slightly as she waited for him to open his door. The purring sound was getting louder. Something impossible was waiting for them on the other side of that door. Something that would change how both the human and the Vellani mother understood their places in the galaxy. Jake's room was different from the other living spaces on the station. While most aliens preferred clean, empty rooms, Jake had made his space feel warm and comfortable. Soft blankets covered his furniture. Plants grew in small pots near the windows. Warm lights made everything glow softly. Most importantly, he had a real bed instead of the hard sleeping platforms that other crew members used. The purring sound was very strong now. It came from inside his room. Zara's motherly feelings were taking over her warrior instincts. Jake could see her hands shaking as he entered his door code. The door opened and showed them something that neither of them expected to see. Two small shapes were sleeping on Jake's bed. Their black scales rose and fell as they breathed peacefully. Kes and Nira had somehow gotten into his private room and made his bed their sleeping place. But that was not the most surprising thing. Dr. Jake Morrison was sitting on the floor next to the bed. His back rested against the wall. He still wore his work clothes from the day before. His eyes were closed and he was breathing slowly like someone who had fallen asleep sitting up. One of his hands was near the edge of the bed, close enough for the cubs to touch if they wanted. The cubs had positioned themselves so they were sleeping right over where Jake's heart would be if he was lying in the bed instead of sitting beside. Zara froze in the doorway. Her mind could not understand what she was seeing. Vellani cubs were programmed by millions of years of evolution to trust only their family. They should be terrified of an alien creature, especially one from a species known for strange behavior. But here they were, sleeping as peacefully as if they were in their own nest back home. Jake woke up when he heard them enter. When he saw Zara standing in the doorway, his face showed relief instead of fear. This surprised Zara because she could easily kill him with her bare hands. "Commander," Jake said quietly, being careful not to wake the cubs. "They showed up about 6 hours ago. I found them scratching at my door when I finished my work shift." "And you did not call security right away?" Zara's voice was barely a whisper, but Jake could hear the danger in it. "They seemed scared and tired. I was going to call you, but they climbed onto my bed and fell asleep almost immediately. I've been watching them to make sure they were safe." Zara stepped into the room. Her sharp senses picked up details that other species would miss. The cub's scent was mixed with Jake's, but in a way that suggested comfort rather than fear. Their body language was completely relaxed. This would be impossible if they felt threatened. Most telling of all, their purring had not stopped when she entered the room. This meant they felt secure enough to stay vulnerable even with multiple adults present. "This is impossible," she said, talking more to herself than to Jake. "Cubs do not act this way with strangers." Jake carefully stood up, moving slowly to avoid startling anyone in the room. "Maybe they do not see me as a stranger." The station boss Grix arrived with security guards within minutes of being told that the cubs had been found. His relief at avoiding a diplomatic disaster quickly turned to confusion when he saw what was happening in Jake's room. "Dr. Morrison," Grix said, his forearms moving nervously, "you realize that keeping the cubs without telling security immediately could be considered kidnapping under space law?" "They came to me," Jake replied calmly. "I was not going to turn away two frightened children." "They are not children," Zara said, though her voice was less sharp than usual. "They are predators. Even at 6 months old, they could seriously hurt an adult of most species." "But they did not," Jake pointed out. "They slept." The cubs had woken up when the security team arrived, but they did not show the aggressive behavior typical of their species when cornered. Instead, they remained calm. Kes, the smaller one, even walked over to Jake and rubbed against his leg in a show of affection that made several security officers step back nervously. Dr. Fresk arrived to study the situation. She belonged to a species called the Karathi, known for their logical minds and lack of emotion. This made them excellent at understanding relationships between different species without getting emotionally involved. Fascinating, she said, watching the cubs through her recording equipment. Commander Zara, has anything like this ever been recorded in Volani history? Never, Zara admitted. Our cubs bond only with family members. Even among our own species, it takes weeks of careful introduction before cubs will accept a new adult. Dr. Fresk turned her attention to Jake. Dr. Morrison, what exactly did you do when the cubs arrived at your room? Jake thought for a moment. I opened the door and they immediately pushed past me into the room. They seemed to know exactly where they wanted to go, straight to the bed. I just made sure they were comfortable and stayed nearby in case they needed anything. You did not try to contain them or contact their parent immediately. They were clearly exhausted and stressed. I figured a few hours of rest would not hurt, and I could watch them until they woke up naturally. Dr. Fresk looked meaningfully at Zara. Commander, I believe we may be seeing something that has never happened before in relationships between species. Your cubs did not just tolerate Dr. Morrison's presence. They actively looked for it. That is impossible. Humans are... Zara paused, realizing she was about to voice a prejudice that might not be as accurate as she had believed. Humans are what? Jake asked, though his tone suggested he was not offended by whatever she might say. Chaotic, unpredictable. Their emotional responses do not follow logical patterns. Jake smiled. You are not wrong. But maybe that is exactly what your cubs needed. Everything on this station is logical and predictable and sterile. Maybe they were looking for something that felt more alive. Dr. Fresk began taking readings with her instruments, scanning both the cubs and Jake for biological markers. Dr. Morrison, your heart rate is unusually slow for a human in a stressful situation, and your body temperature is slightly elevated. I have been told I am good with kids, even scared ones. It is more than that, Dr. Fresk said, studying her readings. You are unconsciously copying the biological signs of a Volani parent in nurturing mode. Slower heartbeat, increased body temperature. Even your breathing pattern has changed to match optimal resting conditions for cubs. Zara stared at Jake with new understanding. You have been studying us. I have been studying everyone on this station. It is my job to understand how different species interact. But this, he gestured to the cubs who had curled up together on his bed again. This was not something I planned or engineered. They chose to come here. Why? Zara asked, though she was not sure if she was asking Jake or herself. Jake looked at the sleeping cubs, then back at their mother. Maybe because they could sense something that adults have trouble recognizing. Maybe they understood that safety is not about strength or claws or being the best predator. Maybe they knew that sometimes the safest place in the galaxy is next to a heart that beats with kindness. 3 days had passed since the cubs were found in Jake's room. The space station had returned to its normal daily routine, but something fundamental had changed. Jake found himself with 2 unexpected companions who had begun following him around the station during their waking hours. This amazed all the other crew members. Zara watched this development with mixed feelings of pride and confusion. Her cubs were showing behavior that challenged everything she thought she understood about her own species. They had begun making sounds she had never heard before. It was a complex purring that seemed to include sounds they were learning from Jake's speech patterns. Dr. Fresk had been studying this phenomenon intensively. Her findings were remarkable enough that she planned to send them to the Interspecies Council. The cubs were not just tolerating human contact. They were thriving in ways that exceeded normal development markers for their age group. Your cubs are learning at a much faster rate than normal, Dr. Fresk explained to Zara as they watched Jake and the cubs in the station's observation deck. Their mental development is advancing faster than any recorded case in Volani literature. Because of the human, because of the relationship they have formed with him. Dr. Morrison provides something your species has never encountered before. He gives unconditional acceptance without the territorial demands that drive Volani social structures. Zara watched Jake as he sat cross-legged on the floor. The cubs climbed over him like he was a living playground. When they got too rough, he simply redirected their energy, rather than asserting dominance or backing away in fear. When they showed him affection, he responded with gentle touch and soft sounds that seemed to calm them at frequencies her cubs found soothing. He is teaching them that Relationships do not have to be based on hierarchy or strength, she realized. Exactly. And they are teaching him about trust in ways that go beyond species barriers. The other crew members had begun to accept this strange new dynamic, though many still watched nervously when the cubs were around. Volani children were, after all, natural predators with sharp claws and teeth. But under Jake's influence, Kes and Nira had learned to moderate their strength when interacting with smaller, more fragile beings. Chief Engineer Rodriguez had been the first to warm up to the cubs after Jake. The stocky human woman had initially been terrified of them, but when she saw how gently they behaved around Jake, her fear had gradually transformed into curiosity. "They are like puppies," she told Jake one day as they watched Kes attempt to imitate Jake's hand gestures. "Deadly puppies, but still puppies. All children are learning machines," Jake replied. "They absorb everything around them and try to make sense of it. These two just happen to have very advanced processing capabilities." The cubs had indeed become learning machines. They had begun to understand basic human words and gestures. More remarkably, they had started to show empathy in ways that Volani adults rarely demonstrated. When a crew member seemed distressed, the cubs would approach carefully and offer what appeared to be comfort through gentle physical contact. This behavior fascinated Dr. Fresk. Volani adults suppress empathetic responses because they interfere with hunting efficiency, she explained to Jake during one of their research sessions. But these cubs are developing empathy as a primary social tool. This is unprecedented. Jake was not surprised by this development. Children learn what they live with? If they live with kindness, they learn to be kind. If they live with aggression, they learn to be aggressive. Species programming is strong, but early environment is stronger. That evening, Jake was in his quarters reading research reports when both cubs suddenly became agitated. They began making distressed sounds and pacing around his room. Their scales, which had grown lighter over the past few days, darkened to their original black color. Jake's door chimed and Zara entered looking concerned. "They are responding to my emotional state," she explained. "I have just received troubling news from our home world." "What kind of news?" "Political tensions are escalating. There may be conflict soon. The Volani High Council is calling all citizens home to defend our territory." Jake felt his heart sink. He had grown attached to Kes and Nira, but more than that, he had come to respect and even like their fierce mother. "When do you have to leave?" "Within the week, if the situation continues to deteriorate." The cubs seemed to understand that something was wrong, even if they could not comprehend the full situation. They positioned themselves between Jake and Zara, as if trying to bridge whatever gap was forming between the two adults. Kes made a sound that was half purr, half whine. She looked up at Jake with eyes that seemed almost human in their expressiveness. Nira moved to Zara and began the complex rubbing behavior that cubs use to comfort distressed parents. "They do not want us to be separated," Zara observed. "Neither do I," Jake admitted. "These past few days have been some of the most rewarding of my career. But more than that, they have been some of the happiest of my life." Zara looked at him with surprise. "You would miss us?" "Very much. You and the cubs have taught me things about family and trust that I never learned from my own species. You have shown me that love is not limited by biology or evolution, or the shape of our bodies." The cubs seemed to sense the emotional weight of the conversation. They moved closer to both adults, creating a small circle of physical contact that included both human and Volani. "There may be another option," Zara said slowly. The High Council message mentioned that citizens involved in critical interspecies research could be granted extended assignments if their work serves the greater good of the Volani people. Jake's heart leaped. "Is what we are doing here considered critical research?" "Dr. Fresk believes it is. She thinks our findings could revolutionize how species interact with each other, not just Volani and humans, but potentially all species." "What would that mean practically?" "It would mean I could request an extension of our stay here, but it would also mean committing to a formal research partnership. This would not be a casual arrangement. We would be pioneers in a completely new field of study." Jake looked at the cubs, who were watching both adults with intelligent eyes that seemed to understand far more than they could express. "I cannot think of anything I would rather do with my life, even if it means spending years working closely with a predator species that most humans find terrifying." Jake smiled and gently stroked Kes's head as she leaned against his leg. "The most terrifying thing about your species is not your claws or your strength. It is your capacity for loyalty and love. That kind of intensity scares most beings because it demands the same level of commitment in return. And you are prepared to make that commitment? I already have, Jake said simply. The moment these cubs chose to trust me with their safety, I became part of your family. The research partnership would just make it official. Zara felt something she had never experienced before when interacting with another species. She felt hope, not just for her cub's future, but for the possibility that the galaxy might be a less lonely place than she had always believed. Then we stay, she decided, and we learn together what it truly means to build a family across the stars. 2 weeks later, the research partnership between Jake and Zara had become official. The Interspecies Council had approved their proposal with enthusiasm that bordered on desperation. Relations between different species had been tense lately, and the success story of the Volani cubs bonding with a human offered hope for better cooperation in the future. Jake's quarters had been expanded to accommodate his new family situation. The station administrators had connected his room to an adjacent space, creating a larger living area that could house both human and Volani comfortably. The cubs now had their own sleeping area, though they still preferred to curl up near Jake whenever possible. The changes went deeper than just living arrangements. Jake found himself adapting to Volani schedules and customs without even realizing it. He had begun waking up earlier to match their dawn activity patterns. His diet had shifted to include more protein-rich foods that would allow him to keep up with 2 growing predator cubs. Most remarkably, his sleep patterns had synchronized with theirs, allowing for the deep, restorative rest that Volani families shared. Zara, meanwhile, was learning human concepts of flexibility and emotional expression that her species typically suppressed. She had begun to understand that showing affection and concern did not necessarily indicate weakness. Under Jake's influence, she was rediscovering aspects of her personality that had been buried under years of warrior training. The cubs were thriving beyond all expectations. At 7 months old, they were already showing cognitive abilities that typically did not develop until their first year. More importantly, they were developing a unique hybrid behavioral pattern that combined Volani physical capabilities with human emotional intelligence. Dr. Fresk documented every aspect of their development with scientific enthusiasm. This is not just behavioral adaptation, she explained to the research team during their weekly meetings. This is actual evolutionary acceleration. The cubs are developing new neural pathways that allow them to process both predator instincts and empathetic responses simultaneously. Is that normal for any species? Asked Dr. Chen, the station's comparative psychologist. It is completely unprecedented. Most species develop along fairly rigid biological lines, but these cubs are creating entirely new patterns of behavior in real time. The implications were staggering. If Volani cubs could adapt this quickly to human influence, what might be possible with other species combinations? The research was already generating interest from governments and scientific institutions across the galaxy, but the success was not without challenges. Kess had begun showing signs of confusion about her identity. Sometimes she would attempt to mimic human facial expressions, which looked disturbing on her reptilian features. Other times she would become frustrated when her natural predator instincts conflicted with the gentler behaviors she was learning from Jake. Nira faced different challenges. As the larger and more aggressive of the 2 cubs, she struggled more with moderating her strength around fragile beings. She had accidentally injured a maintenance robot the previous week while trying to play with it the way she played with Jake. They are caught between 2 worlds, Zara explained to Jake one evening as they watched the cubs sleep. They are not fully Volani anymore, but they can never be human either. I worry about their future. Maybe being caught between worlds is exactly where they need to be, Jake replied. Maybe they are not losing their identity. Maybe they are creating a new kind of identity that the galaxy has never seen before. A hybrid identity, something like that. Think about it, Zara. Your cubs are developing the physical capabilities of apex predators combined with the emotional intelligence of a species known for forming bonds across biological barriers. They could become bridges between species that have never been able to understand each other. The conversation was interrupted by a communication alert. Station Administrator Grix appeared on the wall screen, his forearms moving in agitation. Dr. Morrison, Commander Zara, we have received a priority message from the Interspecies Council. They are requesting an immediate report on your research progress. Why the urgency? Jake asked. There has been an incident in the Andromeda sector. A Volani military unit encountered human civilians in disputed territory. The situation escalated to violence before it could be resolved diplomatically. Several beings from both species were injured. Zara's expression darkened. What kind of incident? The details are classified, but the Council believes your research might provide insights into preventing similar conflicts in the future. They want to know if what you have achieved here can be replicated on a larger scale. After Grick signed off, Jake and Zara sat in thoughtful silence. The cubs sensed the tension and moved closer to their adoptive parents, offering the comfort of physical presence. They want to use our children as proof that their species can get along, Zara said quietly. Is that such a bad thing? If Kes and Nira can help prevent conflicts like the one in Andromeda, would not that be a worthy purpose for their unique abilities? But what if it does not work? What if other cubs cannot adapt the way mine have? What if we have created something that cannot be reproduced? Jake considered this carefully. Then at least we will have proven that it is possible. Sometimes the most important discoveries are not about creating universal solutions. Sometimes they are about showing that barriers can be crossed even if only once. The next day they received visitors from the Interspecies Council. Ambassador Krell, a dignified reptilian being from the Saurian Confederation, arrived with a small team of observers. Their mission was to evaluate the research and determine whether it could be expanded into a larger program. Ambassador Krell watched the cubs interact with Jake with obvious fascination. Dr. Morrison, how would you describe your relationship with these young Volani? They are my family, Jake answered simply. Not in a biological sense, but in every way that matters. I would protect them with my life, and I believe they would do the same for me. And you, Commander Zara? How do you view Dr. Morrison's role in your cubs' lives? Zara hesitated. The question touched on concepts that her species rarely discussed openly. He has become what we call a heart bond. It is a relationship that goes deeper than alliance or partnership. It is difficult to translate into other languages. Try. He has become part of our family core, not a mate, not a subordinate, but something new. He is someone whose heartbeat our cubs recognize as home. Ambassador Krell made notes on his datapad. And do you believe this type of bonding could be achieved between other individuals of your respective species? Jake and Zara exchanged glances. We believe it is possible, Jake said carefully. But it would require very specific conditions and individuals who are willing to be completely open to change. The cubs chose him, Zara added. We did not arrange this bonding. It happened naturally because both sides were willing to trust, despite their differences. Then our next step is clear, Ambassador Krell announced. The Council wants to establish a formal program based on your success. We will be selecting volunteers from multiple species to participate in controlled bonding experiments. As the ambassador and his team prepared to leave, Jake felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Their little family had become the catalyst for something much larger than they had ever imagined. But would scaling up their intimate success diminish its meaning? And more importantly, were Kes and Nira ready to carry the weight of such enormous expectations? Only time would tell if the love that had bloomed in the quiet of Jake's quarters could survive being transplanted into the harsh light of galactic politics. 6 months after the Interspecies Council visit, the station had transformed into something resembling a small city. New sections had been built to house the volunteers and researchers who had arrived to participate in the expanded bonding program. Jake and Zara found themselves as the senior advisors for what was now called the Cross-Species Family Integration Project. The results had been mixed. Some pairings showed promise, particularly between species with similar emotional ranges. A young Karathi female had successfully bonded with twin human children, creating a family unit that combined logical problem-solving with human creativity. 2 elderly Zentari had formed a deep friendship with a middle-aged human couple, sharing knowledge and experiences across vast cultural differences. But there had been failures too. A Saurian warrior and a human teenager had clashed so severely that the experiment had to be terminated for safety reasons. Several other pairings had simply failed to connect, remaining polite but distant throughout the entire process. Jake watched these outcomes with growing understanding. What had happened between his family and the cubs was not something that could be easily replicated or forced. It required a unique combination of circumstances, personalities, and timing that could not be manufactured in a laboratory setting. Kes and Nira, now over a year old, had become the unofficial ambassadors of the program. They moved easily between different species groups, offering comfort to newcomers and serving as living proof that cross-species bonding was possible. Their unique behavioral patterns had stabilized into something that was neither fully Vellani nor human, but entirely their own. They are creating a new category of being, Dr. Fresk observed during one of their research sessions. Not hybrid exactly, but something that transcends traditional species classifications. Is that good or bad? Jake asked. It is unprecedented, which makes it both exciting and concerning from a scientific standpoint. We have no models for predicting their long-term development. This uncertainty had begun to worry Jake more than he cared to admit. Kes and Nira were happy and healthy, but what would happen when they reached adulthood? Would they be able to find mates within their own species? Would they be accepted by Vellani society? Would they always feel caught between worlds? These concerns came to a head when Zara received another message from the Vellani High Council. The political situation on their homeworld had stabilized, and she was being recalled for reassignment. More critically, the council wanted to meet Kes and Nira to evaluate how their unique upbringing might serve Vellani interests. They want to use them as diplomatic tools, Zara told Jake after reading the official summons. The cubs would be assigned to interspecies negotiation teams, using their bonding abilities to facilitate agreements. How do you feel about that? Conflicted. It would give them an important role in Vellani society, but it would also mean they could never have normal lives. They would always be performing their uniqueness rather than simply living it. Jake felt his heart breaking at the thought of losing his family, but he also understood the larger implications. What did Kes and Nira want? This was a question they had been avoiding. The cubs were now old enough to express preferences and opinions, but asking them to choose between their birth culture and their adoptive family seemed impossibly cruel. That evening, Jake sat with both cubs in their favorite spot on the observation deck. The stars stretched endlessly beyond the transparent walls, reminding him of how small their little family was in the vast scope of the galaxy. Kes, Nira, he said quietly, your mother's people want you to come home and help them talk to other species. It would be important work, but it would mean leaving here. Leaving me? Kes made the complex trilling sound that had become her way of expressing deep emotion. Nira pressed closer to Jake's side, her scales warming in the way that indicated affection and distress. We do not want to leave, Jake Hart, Kes said in the mixture of Vellani and human words she had developed, but we do not want to abandon birth people either. Jake Hart was what both cubs called him. It had started as a simple translation of the Vellani concept of heart bond, but had evolved into something more intimate. To them, he was not just Jake the human, but Jake who was connected to their hearts. Maybe there is another way, Nira suggested. Her communication skills had developed along different lines than her sister's. Where Kes mixed languages, Nira had learned to use human body language and Vellani vocalizations to create entirely new forms of expression. What do you mean? Jake asked. Maybe we do not have to choose between here and there. Maybe we can help birth people understand what we learned here. Bring them to Jake Hart instead of taking Jake Hart away. It was a remarkably sophisticated solution from someone barely past infancy by human standards. But then, the cubs had never developed along normal lines for any species. Jake discussed their suggestion with Zara, who was initially skeptical. The High Council is not known for changing their plans to accommodate individual preferences, but they might change their plans to accommodate better outcomes, Jake pointed out. What if we proposed something bigger than just reassigning the cubs? What if we suggested bringing Vellani officials here to observe the program firsthand? You are suggesting that we invite the most militaristic and territorial species in the galaxy to send representatives to a peaceful research station. I am suggesting that we trust the same instincts that led your cubs to my door. Sometimes the most unlikely possibilities are the most transformative ones. The proposal they submitted to both the Vellani High Council and the Interspecies Council was ambitious, beyond anything either organization had previously considered. They requested permission to host a formal diplomatic exchange, where Vellani leaders could observe the bonding program while participating in cross-species negotiations facilitated by Kes and Nira. The response took weeks to arrive. during which Jake found himself barely able to eat or sleep. The cubs sensed his anxiety and began exhibiting stress behaviors that worried everyone on the station. When the reply finally came, it was cautiously positive. Both councils had agreed to a limited trial program. 3 Villani officials would visit the station for a 1-month observation period. If the results were positive, a larger exchange program would be established. They are taking an enormous risk, Zara explained to Jake. Villani leaders rarely leave our homeworld, and never for extended periods. This represents a fundamental shift in how our people approach interspecies relations. What changed their minds?
Kes and Nira. The cubs sent their own message to the High Council.
They recorded a formal request in traditional Villani diplomatic language, but they delivered it with human emotional authenticity. The council had never received anything like it. Jake felt a surge of pride in his adopted children. They had found a way to honor both sides of their heritage while creating something entirely new. They were becoming exactly what he had hoped, bridges between worlds that had seemed impossible to connect. The night before the Villani delegation was due to arrive, Jake tucked both cubs into their sleeping area and sat with them in the comfortable darkness. "Are you nervous about tomorrow?" he asked. "Nervous and excited," Kes replied. "We want birth people to understand what we learned here." "What did you learn here?" Nira was quiet for a long moment before answering. "We learned that family is not about being the same. Family is about choosing to care for each other even when you are different. And we learned that Jake Hart shows love by listening to heartbeats," Kes added, "not just with ears but with whole self." As Jake sat in the darkness with his cubs listening to their breathing synchronize with his own heartbeat, he realized that they had all learned something profound. They had discovered that love was not limited by biology or evolution, or the vast distances between stars. Love was about recognizing the rhythm of another heart and choosing to beat in harmony with it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and uncertainties, but tonight, in the quiet of their shared space, 3 hearts beat together in perfect rhythm. 1 human, 2 Villani, and something entirely new that belonged to all of them. The predator's cubs had gone missing only to find themselves in a place where missing was impossible. They had found their way home to a heart that would always have room for them, no matter how far their journeys might take them among the stars.